At 7:32 in the morning, in one of the new residential districts on the outskirts of Ho Chi Minh City, a delivery app opens without hesitation, and the familiar green marker appears instantly. The courier is already at the complex gate. The order is processed. The estimated arrival time is 15 minutes. Nothing unusual. The same speed, the same predictable window, the same routing logic as yesterday, the day before, a month ago. Residents have grown used to the idea that the city, as fast and noisy as it can be, hums according to a quiet, stable rhythm. Nightload trucks pass through the same intake stations. Network traffic distributes itself without visible dips, and compensation lines in the power grid smooth out the morning surge while thousands of coffee machines heat their water. This steady functioning of urban life feels natural, almost self-generated. But each of these normal processes rests on a hidden layer of decisions, protocols, routes, and tolerances that never enter public view. The system looks simple only because no one sees its stitching. Who authorizes priority rerouting of construction materials when throughput narrows? Who defines the telemetry format for monitoring soil microshifts beneath new housing blocks? Who decides how responsibility is distributed across subcontractors when a concrete flow must be redirected from one frame to another? By day, it reads as the dynamism of a growing metropolis. By evening, it blends back into routine logistics. Yet, it would be worth asking why the underground load-bearing grid of a district was built not according to plans drafted by municipal architects, but according to a specification set quietly in a small technical committee in Singapore. And why that committee, of all possible bodies, ended up producing the only guidelines fully compatible with the city's deformation tracking ecosystem. Or why every supplier of cable trenches clears its plans with the same private entity, despite the fact that it does not formally belong to the construction sector at all. At the level of everyday experience, this dissolves. The district expands, the delivery arrives, the lights come on, the concrete cures in the sun. But beneath that normality lies something more delicate, a mechanism that does not resemble power until you start noticing that it quietly determines what kind of city is ultimately being built. We tend to picture power through the shapes we already recognize. Ministries announcing regulations, governors cutting ribbons at new transit hubs, corporate chairmen standing in front of glass facades while quarterly earnings scroll across the news ticker. These are the visible frames of authority. Symbolic, photogenic, theatrical. Elections, national development plans, investment forums, public-private partnerships, all of it forms the surface layer on which society projects its understanding of influence. And for most people, that surface is convincing enough. It feels transparent. It feels accountable. But the surface rarely tells you how a trajectory is actually set. A minister may endorse an urban expansion policy, but he does not determine which soil compression tests qualify a site for foundational clearance. A billionaire might fund a smart city venture, but he does not specify which data extraction standards a district's IoT network must follow to remain insurable. Even city planners, however authoritative their sketches appear, do not write the compatibility rules that decide which steel mixture is allowed for elevated walkways or which vendor's fiber modules can pass through which regulatory gate. Those decisions live elsewhere, deeper in the stack, in places where attention almost never goes. The more familiar a city becomes, the less anyone questions the scaffolding behind its routines. Zoning maps seem like political choices, but their underlying density coefficients may originate from an old standard tied to foreign lending conditions. Procurement looks like economic strategy, but the vendor shortlist is often shaped by interoperability demands inherited from agreements signed decades ago. And as long as everything functions, the payments clear, the elevators run, the food supply chain stays intact, the mechanisms recede from view. Visible power advertises itself because it depends on recognition. Procedural power does not. It grows through alignment, through repetition, through the unexamined acceptance of technical baselines. You don't need to own a construction conglomerate if you influence the classification logic that determines which construction methods qualify as risk neutral. You don't need to lead a development council if the models they rely on already conform to assumptions embedded far upstream. Influence, in this form, isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It isn't even intuitive. It's the quiet correction layer beneath the public narrative, the one that keeps shaping outcomes long after the spotlight moves on. The earliest traceable point of the family, now quietly shaping entire districts of Vietnam, does not begin with land, capital, or political favor. It begins with documentation. Specifically, a set of structural compliance notes appended to a minor Southeast Asian infrastructure report in the late 70s, authored by a then-obscure engineering cooperative called the Lu Standards Office. The cooperative was not a firm in any conventional sense. No branding, no portfolio, no visible leadership. Its work consisted of verifying tolerances in load-bearing structures for mid-rise developments in provincial towns, tedious reviews of rebar spacing, aggregate density, and subsidence risk. What set them apart was not expertise, which many shared, but positioning. They occupied a gap most overlooked, the interface between regulatory ambiguity and technical necessity. Vietnam at the time was entering a long, uneven phase of reconstruction, where building codes were fragmented, imported materials varied in quality, and urban expansion outpaced institutional modernization. Cities didn't need architects. They had plenty. They needed interpreters, people who could translate evolving global standards into local feasibility. Lu engineers did not design structures. They defined whether a structure could be considered compliant. That distinction, subtle as it was, became their entry point. The family behind the cooperative, never publicly named on any document, followed one principle with monastic discipline: never move into the foreground. They avoided the glamour of development contracts. They refused operational control of projects. They declined offers to co-own construction firms. Instead, they positioned themselves at the junction where plans became approvals, where approvals became certifications, where certifications became eligibility for financing. Their influence was not built through acquisition, but through access. Access to draft protocols, access to regional committees revising import standards, access to the transitional space where old norms dissolved and new ones took shape. Over the next decade, their presence stayed deliberately muted. No press, no ribbon cuttings, no association with developers. Their work appeared only in footnotes, annexes, and margin clauses, places no citizen read and few officials cared to question. They shaped neither skylines nor budgets. They shaped the assumptions that made those skylines possible. And they lived by a single, unwavering rule: never allow the family name to anchor the structure. The structure must stand on its own, invisible, procedural, and persistent. Their influence grew not through expansion, but through sedimentation, a slow layering of rights, roles, and technical obligations that accumulated almost by accident. As Vietnam entered the long arc of modernization, ministries and provincial authorities faced the same recurring problem: fragmented standards, inconsistent materials, incompatible project requirements. Developers needed clarity to qualify for loans. International partners needed assurances that local infrastructure aligned with global benchmarks. Auditors needed baseline thresholds to evaluate structural risk. Each gap produced demand, and the Lu-connected entities quietly filled it. First came advisory memoranda that translated foreign engineering codes into locally usable templates. Then came provisional classification systems for different soil types, drafted at the request of a regional planning board that lacked internal capacity. Later, quietly and without ceremony, came the right to review certain categories of foundation plans before they reached municipal committees, not as a gatekeeper, but as a technical validator whose approval simply made the process smoother. None of these roles appeared decisive. They were modest, procedural, dry. But each role created dependencies, and dependencies tend to entrench themselves. By the late 90s, a small licensing body affiliated with the old Lu office maintained Vietnam's most widely adopted conversion tables for material stress tolerances, tools developers used not because they were mandated, but because every insurer, every foreign fund, every project management officer recognized them as the safest default. A contractor might build with any steel supplier he wished, but if his load documents didn't align with those tables, the project stalled. Around the same period, a Singapore-based regulatory consortium adopted a harmonized compliance format for cross-border construction imports. The format referenced a stress mapping algorithm originally developed by a Lu engineer during a joint research exchange. The reference stuck. Once embedded, it was easier for regional partners to align with the existing model than to rewrite their own. Even when more sophisticated standards emerged, the legacy alignment remained. Too many procurement systems already depended on it. And so, influence deepened. Not by strategy, but by familiarity. Not by force, but by friction. It was simply harder to move away. Throughout all this, the family never appeared. Their legal presence dissolved into foundations, advisory groups, and technical trusts scattered across jurisdictions. They didn't hold land. They didn't run construction firms. They owned something far more stable: the right to define whether a project was standard enough to proceed. In a world where cities race to build faster, that right quietly becomes the skeleton beneath the skyline. The rupture came not as a single dramatic shock, but as a chain of overlapping disruptions that exposed how brittle Vietnam's growth trajectory had become. The early 2000s brought a surge in foreign investment, rapid urban densification, and an influx of new construction technologies that local authorities were not fully prepared to regulate. Then came a series of regional tremors: economic, climatic, administrative. A global manufacturing realignment shifted supply chains into Southeast Asia faster than oversight mechanisms could adapt. Typhoon seasons intensified, forcing cities to reevaluate flood-resilient standards. And an abrupt wave of deregulation, triggered by foreign-funded development agreements, left local agencies without the staffing or technical bandwidth to rewrite foundational policies from scratch. Most institutions responded slowly, constrained by legal procedures and divided responsibilities. Committees spent months debating threshold definitions. Ministries commissioned long studies, whose recommendations arrived long after construction deadlines. Developers, pressured by timelines, gravitated toward whatever frameworks were already compatible with international expectations. And the Lu-aligned architecture, having quietly accumulated decades of procedural scaffolding, happened to be the only system that fit both realities at once. Local enough to understand Vietnamese constraints, global enough to satisfy lenders and insurers. Their stress mapping tables were already referenced by risk rating models. Their soil classification system had been cited in earlier environmental reviews. Their compliance templates aligned cleanly with the emerging cross-border procurement formats. Adaptation required no political defense, no ideological stance, only technical acceptance. While public institutions restructured committees and drafted reform proposals, Lu entities revised their documentation overnight. Where ministries issued circulars in response to flooding, the Lu origin guidelines had already adjusted drainage load coefficients. Where new foreign partnerships demanded harmonization protocols, the Lu technical networks offered ones that matched both legacy Vietnamese materials and international audit expectations. It was not agility in the entrepreneurial sense. It was alignment, a continuity of logic that allowed the system to pivot quickly because its components were never tied to a single jurisdiction or personality. The family did not seize opportunity. The opportunity arrived already shaped by the decades-old logic they had embedded. In the absence of strong central coordination, their frameworks became the fallback. Regional planners adopted them to avoid delays. Lenders recognized them as low-risk defaults. International partners preferred them because they reduced translation costs and compliance friction. None of this was framed as consolidation. No headlines suggested a shift. But beneath the surface, a quiet reordering took place. Governance moved from deliberation to compatibility. By the time cities began discussing long-term resilient strategies, the Lu procedural architecture was no longer a helper. It was the spine around which the new strategies curved. Their influence didn't rise. It thickened, threading itself into the reaction layer of crisis management, where decisions are made too quickly for deeper scrutiny. And the most telling detail is that no one noticed. Not because anything was hidden, but because in moments of uncertainty, people reach instinctively for what already works, not for what needs to be built. By the mid-2000s, the presence of any identifiable family had almost fully dissolved into the architecture they once maintained. What remained was not lineage, not leadership, but an expanding lattice of entities whose interconnections were functional rather than personal. A holding company in Da Nang oversaw archival rights to pre-standardization soil response datasets. A nonprofit in Singapore certified stress analysis software for mid-rise developments. A quiet advisory fund in Vancouver maintained intellectual property clauses linked to early Lu-derived compatibility models. None of these organizations used the same branding. None shared directors. None appeared to coordinate. Yet their documentation referenced the same coefficients, the same formatting logic, the same revision cycles. What began as a small cooperative had become a distributed procedural organism. Developers no longer dealt with people, but with layers. Audit bodies requiring specific telemetry formats, compliance validators insisting on narrow tolerance bands, insurance-linked rating engines calibrated to legacy conversion tables. The frameworks enforced themselves. A consultant rewriting a drainage plan would align it to a risk matrix published by an international consortium, unaware that the matrix's underlying assumptions trace back to an algorithm authored decades earlier by a Lu engineer. A project manager applying for foreign financing would download the standard environmental compliance template, never noticing that its definitions of acceptable subsidence mirrored clauses embedded in a trust registry maintained in another jurisdiction. No individual curated these alignments. They persisted because too many systems already relied on them. Replacing them would have meant renegotiating loan structures, redrafting procurement pipelines, retraining entire regulatory staffs. The inertia was not malicious, it was structural. As personnel rotated out of ministries and development firms, the origin of the standards blurred. New professionals learned procedures without learning their genealogy. The frameworks became axiomatic, technical truth rather than authored choice. Even within the entities still carrying remnants of the old cooperative's DNA, faces changed rapidly, boards reshuffled, consultants cycled in and out, partnerships dissolved and reformed. But the procedural spine, the schema harmonization rules, the signature stress tables, the interoperability clauses, remained untouched because every update linked to a broader ecosystem that could not be altered without destabilizing connected components. In effect, the system ceased to be owned. It became self-sustaining. Influence shifted from inheritance to continuity. Decisions no longer hinged on who sat at a table, but on what the table itself was built to accommodate. And as the human trace faded, the architecture only grew more resilient. A dispersed network of trusts ensured that no single jurisdiction could assert control. Regional consortia mirrored one another's standards automatically. Version-controlled documentation, updated through multi-country committees, whose members often never met in person. No founder to consult, no successor to identify, no authority to challenge. Just procedures that continued to validate themselves because entire cities had learned to depend on them. What was once a family became an environment, a set of constraints so embedded that questioning them felt as unnatural as questioning gravity. And in that disappearance, their influence reached its purest form. Power without a face, without a name, without the need to be recognized at all. Today, when a new satellite district breaks ground outside Hanoi, or a private consortium announces a self-contained future city along the coast, the process appears entirely contemporary and entirely local. Architects unveil sleek renderings, investors outline timelines, municipal committees review environmental reports. Everything looks like modern development, fast, global, competitive. Yet beneath each announcement runs the same quiet chain of dependencies. A contractor selects a soil monitoring module because it is already certified under a regional resilience framework. A procurement officer restricts bids to vendors whose stress analysis outputs match a familiar tolerance band. An insurer conditions coverage on adherence to a drainage model whose logic predates every person working on the project. No one invokes the old cooperative. No one remembers the documents from which these parameters descend. And no one needs to. The influence no longer signals itself. It resides in assumptions, in the formats everyone uses without discussion, in the classification schemes embedded in project templates, in the compatibility requirements that shape decisions before anyone realizes a decision has been made. These are not hidden levers, they are defaults. The quiet rules a city follows when it wants to keep moving quickly. In Vietnam's new urban corridors, where construction cranes rise as predictably as sunrise, the Lu architecture appears nowhere, yet touches everything. It determines which materials qualify as low risk, which layouts count as resilient, which suppliers fit the procurement matrix. Not by control, not by ownership, but by continuity. And because the system is neither centralized nor personal, it cannot be confronted or replaced. It can only be followed, replicated, expanded. Cities adopt it not out of allegiance, but out of necessity. Deviation would slow timelines, complicate financing, and introduce friction into machinery designed to run smoothly. And so, the standards persist, and with them, the invisible logic that shapes the very bones of emerging Vietnamese cities. The skyline changes, the politics shift, the markets fluctuate, but the quiet architecture beneath remains. There is no revelation here, no dramatic unveiling, no name to highlight, only the recognition that the most durable power is the kind that does not need to be remembered to function. It moves with the flow of policy, embeds itself in the habits of institutions, and endures because it aligns with the path of least resistance. In the end, the cities stand, the cranes withdraw, residents move in, and life resumes its familiar rhythm. The machinery hums below, unseen, unremarked upon, quietly determining the contours of tomorrow. And the truth, if it arrives at all, arrives slowly, that the deepest forms of influence are not exercised, but inherited, not by people, but by the infrastructure they leave behind.